Close your eyes and let this land for a moment, not as motivation, not as pressure, but as observation, because most change doesn't fail from lack of effort, it fails from lack of awareness. And as 2026 begins, the majority of people will carry the same reactions, the same habits, the same emotional patterns into a new calendar without realizing that nothing meaningful resets on its own. Time does not transform people, attention does, and the reason most lives remain unchanged year after year is not because people don't want better outcomes, but because they never examine the invisible behaviors that quietly run their days, the reflexes, the comforts, the emotional shortcuts, the unconscious loops that feel familiar and therefore safe. This video is not about discipline as punishment or self-control as restriction. It's about understanding why the absence of awareness keeps people stuck in repetition while convincing them they are trying. The truth is uncomfortable but freeing. Most people don't fail dramatically, they fail quietly, by repeating what feels normal and calling it effort, by confusing motion with direction, by reacting instead of choosing. And as this year opens, there is a rare opportunity to notice what usually goes unnoticed, the moments between intention and action, the space where choices are made automatically. This is not a call to change everything, it's an invitation to see clearly, because once something is seen, it can no longer control you in the same way. Let this be a pause, a mental clearing, a calm look at why most people remain exactly where they are, not because they are incapable, but because they never interrupt the patterns that decide their outcomes long before motivation ever arrives. Most people believe that change requires force, effort, or intensity, but the real reason most people stay the same is simpler and harder to accept. They live on autopilot. Their days are governed by habits they no longer notice and reactions they no longer question. And because these patterns feel familiar, they mistake them for personality or circumstance, when in reality they are just rehearsed responses repeated long enough to feel permanent. Self-control begins not with resistance but with recognition. The moment you notice how often you act without deciding, how often your emotions lead and your mind follows, you start to see why years pass without meaningful difference. People wake up with intentions but move through the day responding to impulses, moods, notifications, and convenience, and then wonder why outcomes don't change. The uncomfortable truth is that most decisions that shape a life are not dramatic, they are small, repetitive, and emotionally driven. What you eat when you're tired, how you speak when you're irritated, what you avoid when something feels uncomfortable. These moments feel insignificant, but they quietly determine momentum. Self-control is not about denying desire, it's about interrupting reflex. It's the ability to notice the urge before obeying it, to feel emotion without being owned by it. Most people never develop this skill because distraction rewards avoidance. Modern life makes it easy to escape discomfort instead of understanding it, and when discomfort is avoided, growth is postponed indefinitely. Staying the same feels effortless because it requires no awareness, but awareness demands energy at first. It asks you to stay present when your mind wants to drift, to pause when reaction feels easier, and this is where most people stop, not because they are weak, but because they are untrained. Self-control is a muscle of attention, not willpower, and attention is depleted when it is never exercised intentionally. The people who change are not those who suddenly become disciplined. They are the ones who begin noticing patterns without judgment. They observe what triggers them, what exhausts them, what comforts them temporarily but costs them later, and instead of fighting these patterns aggressively, they create space between stimulus and response. That space is where choice lives. Without it, every year feels new in theory but identical in experience. Staying the same is not a moral failure, it is a perceptual one. You cannot change what you do not see, and most people never slow down enough to see themselves clearly. As 2026 begins, the advantage does not belong to those who promise transformation. It belongs to those who cultivate awareness in ordinary moments, because once awareness is present, self-control becomes less about force and more about alignment. You stop negotiating with impulses and start choosing based on direction. And that shift, though quiet, is the beginning of real change. Once awareness begins, a deeper resistance often appears, not in the form of laziness or lack of discipline, but as loyalty to the familiar, because the greatest reason people remain unchanged is not ignorance, it is attachment to routines, roles, and identities that feel known even when they feel limiting. Most people don't just repeat behaviors, they protect them because those behaviors confirm who they believe they are. Change threatens identity before it threatens comfort, and the mind's primary function is not growth, it is stability. They allow identity to evolve instead of defending it. This is why progress feels quiet at first, because it is internal, unnoticed, uncelebrated, but deeply reorganizing. As 2026 unfolds, most people will repeat patterns not because they lack opportunity, but because they remain loyal to versions of themselves that no longer fit. The shift begins when you notice what you are protecting, not what you are avoiding, because what you defend most strongly often reveals what you fear losing. And growth begins the moment you allow yourself to outgrow what once defined you. Another reason people remain unchanged year after year has little to do with effort or desire and everything to do with environment. Because behavior does not exist in isolation, it is shaped, reinforced, and normalized by surroundings so subtly that most people mistake environmental influence for personal choice. The places you spend time in, the people you interact with regularly, the inputs you consume daily, all act as quiet signals telling you what is acceptable, expected, and normal, and over time these signals harden into invisible boundaries. Most people try to change themselves while keeping the same surroundings and then wonder why progress feels heavy and fragile. But the mind adapts to context faster than it adapts to intention. When an environment rewards distraction, distraction feels natural. When it rewards urgency, calm feels out of place. When it rewards sameness, growth feels disruptive. This is why discipline feels temporary for most people, because they are swimming against a current they never acknowledge. Environments do not argue with you, they influence you passively, and passive influence is powerful because it bypasses conscious resistance. Routines form not because they are chosen daily, but because the environment makes certain actions easier than others. Reachability determines behavior more than motivation ever will. What is nearby gets used, what is distant gets postponed. They allow identity to evolve instead of defending it. This is why progress feels quiet at first, because it is internal, unnoticed, uncelebrated, but deeply reorganizing. As 2026 unfolds, most people will repeat patterns not because they lack opportunity, but because they remain loyal to versions of themselves that no longer fit. The shift begins when you notice what you are protecting, not what you are avoiding, because what you defend most strongly often reveals what you fear losing. And growth begins the moment you allow yourself to outgrow what once defined you. Another reason people remain unchanged year after year has little to do with effort or desire and everything to do with environment. Because behavior does not exist in isolation, it is shaped, reinforced, and normalized by surroundings so subtly that most people mistake environmental influence for personal choice. The places you spend time in, the people you interact with regularly, the inputs you consume daily, all act as quiet signals telling you what is acceptable, expected, and normal, and over time these signals harden into invisible boundaries. Most people try to change themselves while keeping the same surroundings and then wonder why progress feels heavy and fragile. But the mind adapts to context faster than it adapts to intention. When an environment rewards distraction, distraction feels natural. When it rewards urgency, calm feels out of place. When it rewards sameness, growth feels disruptive. This is why discipline feels temporary for most people, because they are swimming against a current they never acknowledge. Environments do not argue with you, they influence you passively, and passive influence is powerful because it bypasses conscious resistance. Routines form not because they are chosen daily, but because the environment makes certain actions easier than others. Reachability determines behavior more than motivation ever will. What is nearby gets used, what is distant gets postponed. What is visible gets repeated, and what is hidden fades. This applies not only to physical spaces but to digital ones as well. Feeds, notifications, background noise, constant stimulation all teach the nervous system to expect interruption. And once interruption becomes normal, sustained focus feels unnatural. People then blame themselves for lacking discipline when the real issue is that they are embedded in systems designed to fragment attention. Changing outcomes without changing context is exhausting because the environment keeps pulling you back into old rhythms. Real change begins when friction is redesigned, when distractions are made less accessible and intention is made easier to follow. Not through force but through structure. The people who move ahead do not rely on constant self-control. They reduce the need for it. They understand that willpower is finite but environment is persistent, and persistence always wins. This is why small adjustments matter more than dramatic resolutions. Where you place your phone, how you start your morning, what occupies the first quiet moments of the day. These choices determine the tone of everything that follows. Environments also shape identity. You become similar to what surrounds you, not because you imitate consciously, but because repetition normalizes. If chaos surrounds you, chaos feels familiar. If urgency surrounds you, stillness feels wrong. And familiarity often masquerades as comfort. As 2026 continues, many people will try to push themselves harder without noticing that their surroundings quietly undermine them. The shift happens when you stop asking why you lack discipline and start asking what your environment is training you to be. Because once you see that clearly, change stops feeling like a battle against yourself and starts becoming a redesign of the conditions that shape you, and that redesign, though subtle, creates momentum that no amount of motivation ever could. Even when awareness grows and environments shift, many people still stall because clarity itself is unstable. It appears in moments and disappears just as quickly, and the mistake most people make is assuming clarity is a permanent state rather than a condition that must be maintained. Clarity fades not because people forget what they want, but because urgency crowds it out. Modern life rewards immediacy, fast responses, quick decisions, constant availability, and over time this conditions the mind to value what is loud over what is important. Urgency feels productive, but it fragments direction. It pulls attention into the present moment without regard for trajectory. And when every demand feels immediate, nothing feels meaningful. People become busy without becoming deliberate. Clarity requires space, and space is what urgency destroys. When the mind is constantly reacting, it cannot hold long-term perspective. It trades direction for motion. This is why many people feel clear late at night or early in the morning, when demands temporarily quiet down, but lose that clarity once the day accelerates. The problem is not a lack of goals. It is a lack of containment. Clarity needs boundaries to survive. Without boundaries, it dissolves into distraction. This is why people repeatedly revisit the same questions about their life, their work, their direction, not because they are indecisive, but because they never protect the conditions that allow answers to stay present. Protecting clarity means intentionally limiting exposure to noise, not only external noise but internal urgency as well. The feeling that everything must be addressed immediately is a learned response, not a truth. Most things can wait. But urgency convinces the mind that delay equals failure, and under that belief, reflection feels irresponsible. Yet without reflection, direction erodes. People then mistake exhaustion for effort and confusion for complexity, when in reality their mind has been pulled in too many directions without pause. Stabilizing clarity is not about thinking harder. It is about thinking less often but more deliberately, returning to a small set of priorities repeatedly instead of chasing new ones, letting certain questions rest instead of constantly reopening them. Clarity strengthens through repetition, not intensity. The people who maintain direction are not those who constantly seek insight, but those who revisit the same insights consistently. They understand that clarity is fragile and treat it accordingly. They create routines that bring them back to center, not dramatic rituals, but quiet check-ins, moments of recalibration. They accept that clarity will be challenged daily and prepare for that reality instead of being surprised by it. As 2026 unfolds, many people will feel overwhelmed, not because their lives are too complex, but because their attention is too scattered. Reducing urgency does not mean disengaging from responsibility. It means choosing sequence over simultaneity, deciding what deserves focus now and what can wait without consequence. When urgency loses its grip, clarity regains stability, and once clarity is stable, decisions become easier, not because they are obvious, but because they are aligned. Progress then feels less like force and more like continuity, and continuity, sustained over time, is what turns intention into direction and direction into change. Even with clarity protected and urgency reduced, progress often collapses at a quieter point, the moment where intention meets consistency, because many people underestimate how rarely motivation appears and overestimate how often it is needed. They wait to feel ready, energized, or aligned before acting, and in doing so they unknowingly train themselves to depend on a state that is inherently unstable. Motivation fluctuates with mood, sleep, weather, feedback, and circumstance, so when action depends on it, action becomes sporadic. This is why people make strong starts and weak continuations. They mistake the presence of motivation for commitment, when commitment is actually what carries action through the absence of motivation. The people who change are not those who feel inspired most often. They are the ones who reduce the role inspiration plays in their behavior. They design actions that can be performed even on dull, resistant, or uncertain days, because consistency is not built on intensity, it is built on repeatability. Small actions that do not require emotional persuasion accumulate into momentum, while large actions that depend on feeling ready rarely survive contact with ordinary life. This is where many people misinterpret discipline as harshness, when in reality effective discipline is gentle and predictable. It removes negotiation rather than enforcing punishment. When an action becomes routine, it no longer asks for emotional agreement. It simply occurs. And this is why habits outlast resolutions. Habits do not require belief, they require structure. Most people try to motivate themselves into consistency. But consistency emerges when decisions are made once and then repeated without reconsideration. Reconsideration is where doubt enters, and doubt drains energy. The mind tires not from doing but from deciding, and when decisions are repeated daily, fatigue builds quickly. Reducing decision-making is not laziness. It is strategic conservation. The people who maintain progress simplify their choices. They lower the bar for action while raising the bar for continuity. They do not ask whether they feel like doing something. They ask whether it is part of what they do now. Identity plays a role here, but not in the dramatic sense. Identity shifts through evidence. Each repeated action becomes proof, and proof stabilizes belief more reliably than affirmation ever could. When actions are small and consistent, they create an internal narrative that does not rely on emotion. The narrative becomes factual rather than aspirational. This changes how effort is experienced. It feels less like pushing and more like maintaining. Many people fail not because they lack capacity, but because they overestimate how much intensity they can sustain and underestimate how effective low-friction consistency can be. Sustainable change is quiet, often unimpressive from the outside, and therefore easy to abandon in favor of something that feels more decisive. But decisive moments rarely decide outcomes. Accumulation does. As 2026 continues, many people will restart again and again, chasing the feeling of beginning while avoiding the boredom of continuation. The shift occurs when you accept that boredom is not an obstacle but a signal that a behavior has become stable enough to last. When action no longer excites you, it has stopped depending on emotion, and that is precisely when it begins to work. Consistency does not require confidence, it creates it. It does not require certainty, it generates it. And once consistency is established, progress becomes less vulnerable to mood, distraction, and circumstance. It becomes part of how you move through days. And when behavior becomes part of the day rather than a demand placed on it, change stops feeling fragile and starts becoming inevitable. Even when consistency is established, many people encounter a subtler barrier that slows progress without appearing obvious: the weight of expectation. Because once actions repeat, the mind begins projecting outcomes, measuring progress and anticipating results, and this forward-looking pressure quietly distorts behavior. People start performing for a future version of themselves rather than staying anchored in the present process. They begin evaluating every effort for payoff instead of integrity, and when results arrive slower than imagined, discouragement sets in, not because nothing is working, but because expectation has outpaced reality. This is where many people abandon systems that were actually functioning. Mistaking delayed results for failure, expectation creates a constant comparison between what is happening and what should be happening, and that comparison erodes patience. Patience is not passive waiting, it is tolerance for gradual change, and gradual change is how most meaningful progress occurs. When expectation dominates, every action feels like a test. Every day becomes a verdict, and this mental pressure reintroduces urgency under a different name. People stop doing the work for its own sake and start doing it to relieve anxiety about outcomes. Once that happens, the process becomes emotionally charged again, fragile and vulnerable to disappointment. Those who move forward long-term learn to detach effort from outcome without becoming indifferent. They care about direction but not daily validation. They understand that systems mature at different speeds and that early phases often feel unrewarding precisely because they are laying foundations rather than producing visible change. This detachment is not apathy. It is trust in process, and trust reduces mental noise. When you trust the process, you stop monitoring it obsessively. Monitoring creates tension. Tension narrows focus, and narrowed focus exaggerates setbacks. Many people misinterpret a lack of immediate feedback as lack of progress. But most systems operate below the threshold of visibility for a long time. Progress accumulates quietly until it crosses a tipping point. Abandoning the process before that point guarantees stagnation. Expectation also creates identity pressure. People begin thinking in terms of who they should become instead of who they are becoming. This gap generates impatience and self-criticism, both of which drain energy. The more energy is spent evaluating the self, the less remains for action. Progress then slows not because effort decreases, but because attention is misdirected. Those who sustain momentum learn to narrow their focus to execution alone. They measure consistency, not outcomes. They track adherence, not transformation, and this reframing stabilizes effort. Because adherence is controllable while outcomes are not. When attention stays on controllables, anxiety decreases, and when anxiety decreases, persistence becomes easier. As 2026 advances, many people will give up on processes that were quietly working simply because the change did not announce itself loudly enough. The shift happens when you accept that progress is often boring, unremarkable, and emotionally neutral, and that neutrality is not failure, it is stability. Once effort no longer feels urgent or dramatic, it can continue indefinitely, and indefinite continuation is what allows small advantages to compound into significant change. Letting go of expectation does not mean giving up on results, it means allowing results to arrive on their own timeline. When effort is decoupled from outcome, work becomes sustainable, attention clears, and the path forward stops feeling like a test and starts feeling like a rhythm, and rhythm, once established, carries you further than motivation ever could. As effort stabilizes and expectation loosens, another challenge quietly emerges, the return of self-doubt, not loud or dramatic, but subtle and persuasive, because doubt rarely arrives as a clear voice saying you will fail. It arrives as hesitation, second-guessing, and unnecessary reconsideration. It asks whether this is the right path, whether timing is wrong, whether others are ahead, and because it sounds reasonable, many people mistake it for wisdom, but most doubt is not insight, it is uncertainty looking for relief, and when relief is sought through avoidance or constant reevaluation, progress slows without stopping outright, creating the illusion of movement while direction blurs. Self-doubt feeds on comparison, and comparison thrives in silence, the quiet moments where the mind fills gaps with imagined judgments and hypothetical futures. People begin to measure their unseen progress against the visible outcomes of others, forgetting that visibility is selective and often misleading. This comparison distorts perception, making steady effort feel insufficient and patience feel naive. Those who move forward long-term learn to treat doubt as information rather than instruction. They listen without obeying, acknowledging uncertainty without allowing it to dictate behavior. Doubt becomes a signal to refine attention, not abandon direction. It often indicates unfamiliar territory rather than misalignment, and unfamiliarity is a natural consequence of growth, not a warning sign. Many people turn back precisely because the path stops feeling recognizable, mistaking unfamiliarity for error. But growth always carries a period of disorientation, where old references no longer apply and new ones have not yet formed. This in-between phase is uncomfortable because it offers little reassurance, and reassurance is what the mind seeks when certainty fades. But reassurance delays adaptation. Those who persist learn to operate without constant validation. They accept that confidence is not a prerequisite for action, but a byproduct of repeated engagement. They stop asking whether they feel sure enough and start asking whether the direction still aligns with their values and intentions. Values provide stability when confidence fluctuates, because values do not depend on outcomes or comparison. They anchor behavior internally. When action is guided by values rather than mood or certainty, doubt loses much of its influence. It may still appear, but it no longer dictates pace. The mind gradually learns that uncertainty does not equal danger, that lack of clarity does not require retreat, and that progress can continue even when conviction feels muted. As 2026 progresses, many people will interpret moments of doubt as signs to stop or pivot unnecessarily, abandoning paths that simply require time to solidify. The shift occurs when you recognize doubt as a companion of growth rather than an enemy. It walks alongside progress, testing resolve, sharpening awareness, but it does not determine outcome unless given authority. When doubt is allowed to exist without being obeyed, it loses intensity, its questions soften, and eventually it becomes quieter, replaced by familiarity born from repetition. Familiarity restores ease, and ease restores confidence, not through reassurance, but through lived evidence. And once evidence accumulates, doubt no longer feels threatening. It becomes background noise rather than a command, allowing direction to continue uninterrupted, guided not by certainty, but by commitment to forward movement despite incomplete understanding. After doubt loosens its grip, many people still encounter a final, quieter obstacle, the urge to prematurely conclude the journey, to label themselves as finished, fixed, or complete, because progress creates comfort and comfort invites complacency. Once things begin working, attention drifts, effort softens, and the mind subtly shifts from participation to maintenance without awareness. People begin assuming stability will sustain itself, forgetting that what exists now is the result of continued alignment, not a permanent state. This is where growth quietly plateaus, not through collapse, but through gradual neglect, small deviations tolerated, routines softened, standards relaxed just enough to feel harmless. And because nothing breaks immediately, the drift goes unnoticed. Progress does not reverse at once. It erodes slowly, invisibly, until one day momentum feels harder to regain than it was to build. Those who continue advancing understand that stability is active, not static. It requires attention even when things feel fine, especially then, because comfort reduces vigilance, and reduced vigilance allows old patterns to return in subtle forms. Familiar distractions resurface, minor compromises multiply, and before long the system that once supported growth becomes a loose structure that no longer holds direction firmly. This is why long-term change demands periodic recalibration. Not dramatic reassessment, but quiet review, asking whether actions still reflect intention, whether environment still supports direction, whether habits still serve purpose rather than convenience. People who sustain progress build checkpoints into their lives, moments to step back and realign without panic. They do not wait for breakdown to intervene. They understand that maintenance is not the absence of work. It is work of a different kind, less visible but equally important. This mindset prevents both burnout and stagnation, because it accepts that growth is cyclical, periods of building followed by periods of stabilizing, followed by renewed expansion. Resisting this cycle creates frustration. Embracing it creates continuity. Many people chase constant improvement without respecting consolidation. Others consolidate too long and mistake rest for completion. Balance comes from recognizing when to push and when to reinforce. This discernment develops through experience, not theory, and requires honesty without self-judgment. As 2026 unfolds, many people will either exhaust themselves by never pausing or stall themselves by pausing indefinitely. The advantage belongs to those who treat progress as an ongoing relationship rather than a destination, who remain engaged even when urgency fades, who adjust without abandoning, who refine without resetting. They understand that lasting change does not announce itself with milestones. It expresses itself through stability, through behavior that no longer feels forced but still receives attention. The moment you stop paying attention to what works is the moment it begins to weaken. Not because it fails, but because it is neglected, and neglect is rarely intentional. It is the byproduct of comfort. Recognizing this pattern early prevents drift from becoming regression. It keeps growth alive without demanding constant intensity, and it allows progress to mature instead of collapse. This stage is quieter than all the others because it does not involve struggle, it involves stewardship, caring for what has been built so it continues serving its purpose. And when stewardship becomes part of how you think, progress stops feeling temporary. It becomes a way of moving through time, adaptive, responsive, and resilient, no longer dependent on motivation, novelty, or urgency, but sustained by attention, intention, and respect for the process that brought you here. Even when progress is sustained and stewardship is learned, one last internal shift determines whether change becomes permanent or remains conditional, the relationship you have with time. Because many people still live as if life is something to be rushed through, optimized aggressively, or arrived at as quickly as possible, and this impatience quietly distorts decisions. People compress timelines in their mind, expecting years of internal change to resolve within months, and when reality refuses to match that pace, frustration emerges not outwardly, but as subtle dissatisfaction, a feeling that something should be happening faster. This impatience often hides beneath productivity, ambition, and constant planning. But at its core it reflects an inability to stay with the present without mentally escaping into future outcomes. The mind becomes oriented toward arrival rather than engagement, and when arrival becomes the focus, the present feels like an obstacle instead of a medium. This creates a restless relationship with life, where nothing feels sufficient because it is always being measured against what comes next. People then rush decisions, abandon paths prematurely, or layer unnecessary complexity onto simple systems, all in an attempt to accelerate results. But acceleration without stability leads to collapse, not growth. Those who internalize lasting change develop a different relationship with time. They stop treating it as something to defeat and start treating it as something to work with. They understand that time is not empty space to be filled with outcomes, but the medium through which depth, skill, and alignment form. This shift reduces anxiety dramatically, because it removes the sense that one is falling behind. Behind whom? Behind what? Often remains unclear. But the feeling persists as long as progress is framed as a race. Many people unknowingly compete with imagined timelines created by comparison, social narratives, or internalized expectations, and this competition fuels impatience. Impatience fuels overcorrection, and overcorrection destabilizes otherwise functional systems. When time is respected, action becomes steadier, decisions become less reactive, and effort becomes more sustainable. People stop forcing progress to justify itself constantly and allow it to unfold. This does not mean passivity. It means alignment with natural pacing, recognizing that some developments cannot be rushed without losing their integrity. Confidence, clarity, skill, and identity all mature through repetition across time, not compression. As 2026 continues, many people will feel pressure to make something happen quickly, to prove progress, to validate effort. But those who endure will be the ones who release the urgency to arrive and instead commit to showing up consistently within the time available. They will stop asking how fast things are moving and start asking whether they are still moving in the right direction. This question anchors attention where it belongs, in alignment rather than acceleration. Once time is no longer treated as an enemy, patience becomes less effortful, waiting no longer feels like stagnation, and progress no longer feels fragile. It becomes integrated into daily life, unfolding at a pace that allows it to last. And when this relationship with time stabilizes, change no longer depends on pressure or deadlines. It becomes something you grow into rather than chase, steady, cumulative, and resilient, shaped not by urgency, but by commitment to remaining engaged with the present long enough for it to transform you. At the end of this path, what remains is not a technique, a rule, or a dramatic realization, but a quieter understanding about how change actually settles into a life. Permanence is not created by intensity, nor by insight alone. It is created when behavior, attention, and time begin to agree with each other, when what you do daily no longer argues with what you say you value. This agreement removes internal friction, and friction is what exhausts most people long before effort ever does. The moment change becomes permanent is the moment it stops feeling like a project and starts feeling like a way of moving. You no longer wake up asking what needs to be fixed. You wake up participating in something already in motion. This does not mean everything is resolved. It means direction is no longer fragile, setbacks no longer threaten identity, pauses no longer feel like failure, and uncertainty no longer demands escape. The mind learns to stay with process without constantly seeking reassurance, and that staying is what allows depth to form. Most people search for a final breakthrough, a point where effort ends and ease begins. But ease does not arrive as an event. It arrives as familiarity, as repetition without resistance, as actions that no longer require persuasion. This is why lasting change often feels anticlimactic. There is no announcement, no internal celebration, just a quiet recognition that certain struggles no longer arise in the same way. What once required effort now requires attention. What once required motivation now requires maintenance. And this transition is where many people lose sight of progress because they are still looking for drama. But real stability is undramatic. It blends into life so seamlessly that it stops being noticed. And that is its strength. As this series concludes, there is nothing here to finish or complete. No checklist to satisfy, no standard to reach, only an invitation to continue with awareness, to remain attentive, to drift, to revisit alignment without urgency, to allow growth to mature rather than forcing it to perform. The work does not end, but it also does not demand more than you can give. It asks only that you stay present enough to notice when direction begins to slip and patient enough to correct it without self-criticism. If there is a single thread running through everything you've heard, it is this: lasting change is not about becoming someone else. It is about removing what interferes with becoming more fully who you already are. When interference fades, effort lightens, clarity stabilizes, and time stops feeling like something you are racing against. It becomes something you are moving with, and that shift is what allows progress to continue quietly, sustainably, without needing constant reinforcement. So let this end without urgency, without instruction, without a call to action. Let it settle as a way of seeing rather than something to do. Return to it when noise builds, when pressure rises, when direction feels unclear, not to restart, but to recalibrate, because recalibration is how momentum survives. And as you move forward from here, do so without announcing it, without proving it, without measuring it too closely. Stay engaged, stay attentive, and allow time to do what it has always done best. Deepen what is practiced consistently. This is not the end of anything. It is simply a quieter way of continuing.